Dehancer Pro has so many different features and so many different film profiles that I thought I'd put a video together so you can see all the different profiles without having to go through all of them yourself. Today we are looking at Dehancer Pro, and this is available on various editing softwares, and I'm today using it on DaVinci Resolve. Now this isn't a review of the software, nor is it a tutorial either. There are plenty of tutorials out there that give you much more detail, much better than I ever could, showing you how to get a certain look and all this kind of stuff, so I think I'll leave that to the experts of color grading. Instead, this is just an introduction to what features it has, as well as a complete showcase of all the different film profiles, because I think that's the one thing that might be a bit frustrating, is to figure out which profiles you want to use for your projects. Now, if you don't know what Dehancer is, it's basically a film emulation plugin for your editing software. You can do all of this inside the editing software that you use. So in DaVinci Resolve, you can do all of these features manually using the various effects and features that are available in the color page. However, the idea of Dehancer is to make things a bit simpler, put them all in one place, and make sure that things interact as you'd expect, as if you were processing film. I think that's kind of very much their mindset when it comes to how this software actually works. Now, this definitely could be used in two different ways. Either you're a professional color gradist and you really want to get the absolute best film look out of something, and you might use some of these features to kind of really fine tune exactly what you want. Or it could be the other end. It could be a really quick solution just to get you a certain look without having to manually do everything yourself. Both ways are completely valid, and there's no wrong way of doing these kind of things. It's just there's so many different options, so many different ways of doing it, and this certainly is just one really good way about it. Before we actually get into the features and the node trees you can see here, we first have to select the pipeline that we want to go down. And once again, there's not really a wrong answer. You probably have a preferred way of doing things. You can do it Ace's way, you can do it with the DaVinci wide gamut, or you can use color space transform, or you can use the one that's built into the actual plugin itself. If you want to go down the route of using the DaVinci wide gamut pipeline, then what you'll need to do is go down to your settings in the corner there. Then that brings up on the color management page. You've got your color science, so you just need to make sure you select color managed. And there you need to just untick this automatic color management. Once you've done that, it's going to give you the ability to go on the drop down on the color processing mode and make sure that you actually select HDR DaVinci wide gamut intermediate. In addition to that, you'll also want to switch your output color space to Rec 709 scene. Once you've done that, you can save it and go into Dehancer Pro. Turn that on. As you can see here, it gives you quite a strong look out of the gate, which is the reason why I had it turned off there, not to confuse things. And you just need to make sure that you, in the source selection, select the DaVinci wide gamut intermediate. Now, that isn't, of course, the only way. You can use color space transform instead. A lot of people prefer doing that way, where of course you input your input color space and your input gamma, and then make sure that the output gamma is set correctly as well. And that's another way of doing things. Or you can go into Dehancer Pro, and this is probably the kind of quick dirty solution if you're not doing something a bit more advanced. And just within here, you can do a very simple camera selection. So if you know which camera that you've used, just quickly go in here, and you can then find the camera, Blackmagic, Pocket 4K, and then it will have the format available for that, the log profile effectively. And as simple as that. And that's a really quick solution to get you to exactly where you need to be. And all these options are great. There's a pros and cons to picking whichever way. It's just more down to kind of what you're used to doing and what you prefer. So the node tree. Now this, once again, isn't a requirement. You don't have to do this. This isn't like, if you don't do this, it's not going to work. You could just, if you wanted to, have none of this and literally just use Dehancer Pro on its own. And you could do pretty much everything from within here. That is totally possible. But it's probably a good practice to get into the habit of doing proper node trees, laying them out on all your shots and just making sure you kind of stick to a certain pattern. So how they've got it laid out is they say first do your primary corrections in the sequence. If you want to do noise reduction, they do actually recommend that you do that before. But if you do, they also recommend that you should actually render it out as ProRes is an intermediate, rather than trying to edit in the format that it's come in, because it's going to really slow your computer down. Now I've put primary color correction as just one single node here. They've actually listed down separating it up to white balance, contrast, whatever it may be that you want to do. So obviously you can just add more nodes in there, and then what you would just have to do is do your primary corrections, make sure that you get that all looking correct within that area. Next up on the node tree, if you've got your mask. So this is if you want to mask out, say, someone's face, and you want to make sure that corrections are applied differently there, or perhaps you want to add a bit of vignette, or maybe a bit of any sort of masking in the background, whatever it may be. So this is where you'll have parallel nodes so you can do those different areas without affecting other areas of the image. If you're going down the route of using a color space transform, this is where you would actually add it after the masks, after the primary corrections, but before the plugin. So that's where you want to place it in. Next up in the node tree, you have the actual plugin itself, and we'll be going through that in a moment. And finally, after that, they recommend that you do sharpening. Any sharpening you want to do it after you've applied all these effects. That obviously makes sense. You know, you don't want to be applying the plugin and the film look to overly sharpened images. That just doesn't make sense. It would look really terrible. So you want to do that on last in your node tree. It's the last thing that you want to be affecting your image before you do your output. Now let's talk about the actual plugin itself. So we're going to turn it on, and the first thing you'll notice is that, oh god, the image doesn't look that great. It's a bit annoying that they've decided to pick the Kodak Vision 3 as the initial film profile that you get instantly appearing. I think it's not really a great confidence inspiring color film print. I think I'd have rather seen maybe something a bit warmer, because I think for most people you probably want a slightly warmer, nicer image, unless you're going down a very particular look. You also probably notice that it has also applied film grain instantly as well, so we'll just turn that off just to give us a cleaner image. So that's kind of our starting point when looking at this image now. First up at the top, of course, as I mentioned before, you've got your input selection. So whether you're using wide gamut, whether you're using just a Rec 709 color space, or whether you're going to be using a camera to do the conversion within the plugin. Sure. Below that, you've got your basic sort of camera exposure compensation, temperature adjustment, and tint, all the usual kind of things. As I say, their recommended way of doing the node tree is that you do that sort of stuff in your primary corrections at the beginning over here, but there's certainly no reason why you couldn't do it here instead. If you just wanted to use just the plugin on its own, this is where you would go ahead and do those sorts of tweaks. Next up, first on the list, is you've got your film profiles. So you've got a nice big selection of film profiles here. It is a bit annoying when you go through them that you can't actually just kind of go down on your arrow on your computer to see through each of the film profiles. You have to manually select each one like this. That's why at the end of this video, I've got every single picture profile shown. That's just an easy way for people to see all the different looks in one place. So make sure you hang around to the end to see that. What's quite cool below, they've actually got a push and pull adjustment for the film profile. So this is basically how the film print reacts with the footage, whether it's affecting it more in the highlights or in the shadows. So as you can see as I move along here, the color actually kind of shifts quite a bit actually as you move around. So you can get quite a different look from different profiles just by adjusting how much it's pushing and pulling different areas of the image into the print itself. We have film compression below, and this just really is for adjusting kind of your highlights and the roll off of the top of the image. You can see right there actually how it's adjusting the waveform, and it's just the top of the image that's being affected. So if you've got highlights that maybe are peaking or very near peaking, this is a good way of softening down, giving it that more filmic look, and this is where you would be tweaking it around. The tunnel range obviously there is going to obviously affect the range that you do that with. Now this isn't going to bring back completely blown sky. So if we look at this shot, in the top corner there, as you can see on the waveform, is completely gone. Now, so if we go in here, we're suddenly not going to recover those highlights. We're not going to suddenly bring something that's not there back to life. That's just how you shoot it on the day. You still need to make sure you expose correctly, although that was the sun, so I'm happy that was overexposed. There's no issues. But you certainly can soften it down a bit so to give it a much more pleasing look in those highlights. And then finally you've got the color density, and this is really quite cool. Once again, this isn't like saturation, which kind of overpowers the image. This is just going to work on one area. So in this case, it's just working on those highlights, just making sure that saturation is coming in a much more natural way. You can use the expand tools to adjust where the black point and white point are. So you can see here, we can blur out the image quite easily, but we can just sort of adjust it so we get it just right and really stretch the image as much as you want, hence the name expand. And this is something you probably would go back to quite a bit as you're doing your color grading. Next up, you've got your print. So this is like the output. So this is very much the whole, I think, ethos of this plugin is that it is like doing the entire process of working with film. So you can actually keep it on linear, and that just keeps it quite a simple system where allows you to play around with these settings without actually affecting the color of the image. But you can also select a certain film print as well. So you've got Fujifilm here. Got this Kodak one there as well, which actually I really like the look of that. It looks pretty good. And also you've got a glossy paper one here, which you can tweak. And once again, you can affect how that applies to all of this process. So each stage, you can constantly tweak and adjust how each of these elements is interacting with your footage. You can almost see this as layers. As you go down, you've got your base layer here, and as you go down the list, it's kind of adding more and more things over the top and interacting with what you've done previously. Keeping in the film processing sort of mindset, you've got the color head. Once again, this is all stuff you could do color wheels, but they've just done it in the style that you would have done film in. So you've got your yellows and blues that you can adjust between, magenta and green, cyan and red, and so on. You can gang them all together. So if you want to sort of change the entire tone of the image for all at the same time. You also can affect what areas that these affect, whether it's the shadows, the midtones, or the highlights, as well as the exposure that you're preserving. Now, film grain, this is the one that I'm probably most excited about with this software. And if there's going to be one part that I think you'd really recommend you purchasing from Dehancer, it would be the film grain plugin, because I think it does a really good job of adding noise. And okay, this is pretty extreme. This is probably too much, certainly for this image. But there's lots of adjustment here. You can really get grain in a style that you want. It completely generates it from scratch, so it's not like it's going to be the same looking grain all the time. It seems to interact really well with the colors that are in the image already as well. And that's apparently a big thing that they've really pushed to try and give it a unique sort of organic look, is that it will adjust depending on actually what it is interacting with. You can affect what areas that there's more of it or less of it, whether it's in the shadows, the midtones, and the highlights. As you can see, they're all here. And then you've got your film type. You've got negative or positive. Negative is a lot more stronger look. As you can see, it looks really quite noisy, quite a grittier look, whereas you can obviously go positive. And that's probably a bit more restrained and more useful for probably more use cases, I'd imagine. So next up is halation and bloom, and these are two things that sort of work quite well together. It might be something you use a particular lens for to get this look, or maybe a lens filter, and it's certainly something that people really aspire to having when trying to make their image look a little bit more filmic. It's just one of those little flaws that older lenses or vintage lenses and older film you may see that you don't necessarily see in a modern digital cinema camera. So with halation here, I've actually turned it on really quite extreme, so you can really see where the highlights are. You've suddenly got this like red fringe that is just going around the edges, so let's just zoom in just to really see it. So this is pretty extreme use case scenario where you can see if I really amplify it up, you can really see how it kind of glows away. But you can just kind of tweak it, soften it down a little bit by using all the different settings and get it to how you kind of want. It's one of those things you won't want to use too crazy, but it just adds a little bit of sort of realism to the image. And you can see if you turn it on and off, it's actually just warming the image up as well in the process. So, and you can compensate that as well there. So there's different options to tweak it and adjust it, and you can change the impact, which is basically the opacity. It's just how much it actually comes through on the image. As default, it's set to about 80%, which probably makes a lot of sense, really. You can use the mask mode as well, and the mask mode just allows you to see where in the image it's actually being affected. So you can see as it's all dropped down, you can't see it anywhere, but if I increase it up, you can see where actually we're seeing some of that halation actually landing on the image. Now, they recommend that you actually pair this with bloom together. They often work well together, and they might look a bit odd if you only use one on its own. And bloom's pretty obvious. So think of a mist filter, you get a nice sort of a blooming of the highlights, softening of the highlights, and well, that's exactly what it does here. It's the same thing, but doing it digitally in post rather than doing it in camera. And I think for a lot of times, this is actually the more sensible route to go. I think it can be quite risky using a filter on the front of your lens if you're doing it with a client that isn't aware of what you're trying to achieve. If it's a very clear stylistic choice that you and the client have agreed on and they're happy with the style, then yes, go for it. But don't just stick a mist filter on the front of your lens without making sure that they're definitely going to be happy with it. Because once you've done that, you can't get rid of it. At least doing it in software here, it might not be as good. You know, it depends on how much time and effort you can put into it. but at least you can actually remove it quite easily, unlike if you do it in camera. Next up is Vignette, and of course it does exactly what it says on the tin, which is you can apply a vignette to your image. Quite straightforward to use. And you've got various size adjustments here, various amounts of feathering, as well as the aspect ratio, and of course where in the image it actually appears. Film Breathe and Gate Weave are the two that are going to give you that sort of old school little shake of the image, as if it was actually shot on film. Personally, I think this can look really gimmicky. Maybe if you've got a really particular look you're going for, or you're very, very good at really nailing real subtlety in the image, then go for it, play around with it. But I think in most cases, I think most people, they want the sort of general look of film, but they don't want that sort of shaky, you know, something shot in the 1930s style look, in which case they probably won't be touching these settings, but they're certainly there. And they're obviously a bit more process intensive as well. That's the other thing. So you can see it really slows down trying to play back if you do that. So generally, I think for most people, it isn't a great option to go with. I think you generally will probably want to keep those two options turned off in most cases. Finally, at the bottom, you've got a few extra options down here as well. Monitor's pretty cool. So you've got false color, which is great to have. So you can see obviously what stuff is peaking quite easily, just like you have on your camera. Always really nice to have. You've also got a clipping indicator. So this is a bit like how in Photoshop and in Lightroom, how you can see what areas are clipping, or either in the highlights or in the shadows. So it obviously goes red if the highlights are clipping like there. So we don't want that. We want that filmic look. So we can then obviously adjust our white point down again to get it much more within the range. And then of course with the areas that are too dark and we've clipped the blacks and the shadows, they actually come up as blue. So it's a really nice easy way of quickly seeing what parts of the image have gone too far. And I think it's nicer than just using false color all the time, because you can just leave it turned on, you know. So it's almost quite good, because you know then if you're not seeing any bits of blue or red, your image is safe. It's all within the areas and everything is good. But obviously if it starts clipping too far, then suddenly you're going to see these warning signs pop up on your image. Finally, you can adjust the overall opacity that is being applied for the plugin as a whole. Obviously you could do this within DaVinci Resolve's normal keying options down in the bottom corner there, but it's nice that you can do it within the plugin as well. You've also got a LUT generator, so this is really handy in case you want to take the look you've developed in here on set. Obviously things like, you know, the gate weave and the film breathing and the print aren't going to be applied to the LUT. What you're going to get is the actual colors and the look that you're applying. You also see there in options you've got normal, fast and high, slow. They actually recommend that normal is fine for 99% of work out there. Unless you're doing something very high end, then maybe you want to set it to high. But even then, you probably would actually do most of your actual color grading set to normal and just do your final output and checks in high. For the comparison of the different film profiles, I've just made the image as neutral as possible. It doesn't necessarily look nice, it's just that the whites are correctly white based on the waveform below. So hopefully you just get a good idea of actually how the film profile adjusts the image. For the comparison, I've also turned off all the additional adjustments you can make within the plugin. As you've seen, there's plenty of ways you can tweak and adjust the image and the look all the way through the process. So it would be unfair to set a certain look, because obviously it's going to affect the image quite a bit. Even by adjusting the push and pull, you're going to get a very different look from each of those color profiles. So instead, it's just going to be on sort of the base settings. None of this is going to be turned on except for the film profile, and the push pull is going to be set to 0. So it's just basically what you'll see if you were flicking through the profiles in the plugin.